Here at my YouTube channel, I want to include videos that teach you a lot about sewing notions. Sewers have to have their tools just like men need their tools. So watching my videos will help you create a list of what you need to have. A sewer has to have pins, and all pins are not created equal. Back when I started sewing, this was a pin. A tiny little piece with an itsy bitsy little head on it. They're frequently called silk pins. To me, I just can't get hold of this. Now I have really big hands, but this is not a pin. I may as well not have it. I hate those things. Instead, what I highly recommend are these glass head pins. You can tell that they're glass just if you put your tooth on it. You want glass head pins, not plastic head pins. And why do you suppose that would be? Well, a lot of times you are pressing, and sometimes you still have your pins in when you press. And if a hot iron gets held on a plastic pin, that could be not a pretty thing. So instead, I always go for glass head pins. The two brands that I carry at my website are the Clover pins and also the IBC, imported by Clotilda pins. And I recommend either one of them. They're not inexpensive, but that's fine. It just means that you will bend down and get some exercise picking them up from the floor instead of vacuuming or sweeping them up. And when it comes time to pick up those pins from the floor, and even as you sew, I really love a magnetic pin cushion. I can be sewing along and just throw my pins that direction. If you have your mess that you're sweeping up from the floor, you can just sweep that magnet and all those pins that you invested in will come popping up to your magnet. The other thing that I like to hold my pins is the useful pin cushion. This is a wad of very highly felted wool. Wool has lanolin in it, so that naturally lubricates your pins. So I try to use both of these. This one to lubricate my pins, and this one just so that I can throw my pins that direction. I love them both, and especially this one because it sits flat, in contrast to that tomato pin cushion that just flops everywhere. So do invest in good pins as you sew. And they're pins, they're not needles. A lot of my starting sewing students call them needles, and I say no, a needle has an eye and a pin has a head. All right. Now that I've given you Londa's 2 cents worth on the best kinds of pins to use, you need to know how do you use them. Well, one place where you can use pins is when you actually take a pattern piece and pin it onto your fabric to cut out the piece in the first. So when you lay your pattern piece on your fabric, you don't just lay it down, do you, Melanie?
No, I learned that in class. No, you do not.
And what did you used to think?
You could just eyeball it.
Right, and you did know about the arrow.
I did.
Okay, but the arrow, as Ms. Londa taught you, needs to be parallel to the selvage of the fabric. So in order to do that, what you do is you pin down one end of the arrow and then you measure it exactly from that arrow over to the selvage. So I'm going to go to where this selvage changes from blue to white, and that's right at 10. So then all I need to do is move this down to the other end of the arrow, put the 10 right here at the same place, and then you see I can move this piece so that that grain is exactly where it needs to be. And then I pin down that end of the arrow. Now this was a very short pattern piece chosen on purpose so that you could see it all, but if this were the front of a garment or a skirt, you'd have that arrow being much longer. Now that you have the grain line perfectly parallel to the selvage or the fold, then you would need to take your pins, and I like to have my students, and I always have over the years, place the pins in parallel to the edge. Now generally I would go to each corner first, get down the corners, smoothing the pattern piece so that it's nice and smooth, and then go back and add some pins in between the corners. These days I cut out with a rotary cutter on a rotary cutting mat. So this is one reason that I put my pins in parallel instead of perpendicular, because if I were coming along with a rotary cutter, I for sure wouldn't want to run into that pin. That would be one dead rotary blade. Or Neither would I want to cut into it with my scissors. Besides that, a pin placed in parallel holds more of that pattern piece down to the fabric. You can also use weights. I know people who use small little weights, washers, heavy washers from the hardware store, even for larger pattern pieces, cans of tomato paste. But you really need to accurately pin down your pattern so that it's parallel and straight grain, then pin corners, then pin in between, and for that I recommend that your pins be parallel to the edge. On the other hand, when you are taking two pieces that you have cut out and you're ready to actually pin the pieces together before you sew them, can you see that I put the pins in perpendicular? So not parallel, because if I put them in parallel, I would be running into them as I sewed, but rather I put them perpendicular.
Action.
Now that I put my pins into my fabric in a perpendicular fashion rather than parallel, I can start to sew. So here I am, I'm going to sew my seam forwards and backwards a little bit to begin with. I'm going to get my hands in proper sewing position. So I have a taut situation, so I'm doing everything right. I bet a lot of you are just screaming bloody murder at me because I've just sewn over 3 pins. You know what? In my book, it's okay. And I'm going to give you permission to actually sew over pins. I have sewn over pins for 55 years, and I haven't injured myself. I haven't messed up a sewing machine. It's held things together when I needed them held together. Have I stopped and taken out pins before I've gotten to them? Oh yeah, because I've heard people say, a lot of people say, that you should never sew over a pin. I'll make you a bet that if you took 10 sewers and you said, please be perfectly honest with me, do you ever sew over pins? At least 3 to 4 of us would admit that we do. I asked a very, very seasoned sewing machine repair guy about this one time because I had heard so frequently from sewing machine dealers, other ones, from other sewers, oh my gosh, I never sew over pins. How can you do that? So I asked him, I thought if anybody would know if this is what messes up a sewing machine, Mr. Stewart would know. And this is what he told me. He said, Londa, unless you are sewing over nails or you are sewing with a very, very short stitch length, any sewing machine with its salt should be able to sew over pins. So for what it's worth, when I was selling sewing machines, I would demonstrate to someone and I would sew over a pin and they'd go, oh, sew over pins? And I said yes, and I wouldn't sell you the sewing machine if sewing over pins were going to break it. Take it, leave it, it's certainly up to you. You've made your investment in your machine. I've made my investment in this machine and many, many others through the years. Yes, I wear glasses now. I didn't used to. Am I going to perhaps dull a needle? Yes. Occasionally that might happen, but that's going to happen regardless, and we'll have another video about needles. But I do give you permission to sew over pins. Now, I know I'm going to get a bunch of comments down below. You go right ahead and comment. You're not going to change my mind. I may well not change your mind, but sewing police, come take me to the sewing jail. It hasn't happened yet. I sew over pins. Take it or leave it. Join me for Creative Fashion Sewing, where you'll find oodles of inspiration and detailed how-tos. For a constant stream of sewing fun, follow me and subscribe to my social media channels.